This week, Volodymyr Zelensky launched an industrial-scale charm offensive as he and Europe's political elite descended on the White House in order to discuss the next steps in efforts to force Russia to contemplate peace. The man hosting those talks, Donald Trump, claimed afterwards that a meeting between Mr. Zelensky and his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, was closer than ever.
We're going to have a meeting. I think if everything works out well today, we'll have a trilat. And I think there will be a reasonable chance of ending the war when we do that.
A claim that the Kremlin has largely played down. The West is hardly on the same page either, with America rejecting Europe's insistence that a ceasefire in Ukraine is necessary to pave the way for meaningful negotiations. But Washington did soften its position on the contribution it would be willing to make to security guarantees for Ukraine in the event of a pause in the fighting. So is this simply token diplomacy, or is momentum beginning to shift in attempts to bring the conflict to a close? We'll be answering your questions on that and more with our expert panel.
I'm James Waterhouse.
And I'm Steve Rosenberg.
And I'm Jamie Coomarasamy. Welcome to Ukrainecast.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.
Well, we have to start with the fact that we have you here in the studio, Steve. Although actually, even before that, an amazing piece of news that I gleaned just before we started this recording. This is the first time you, our Moscow correspondent, our Russia editor, has actually met our Kiev correspondent, James Waterhouse. In how many years have you been covering this?
Well, 3.5 years, not as long as Steve, but
I'm so pleased to meet you.
Yeah.
After all this time, I sent you an email when you got your job.
You did, yeah. And you sent me you sent me lovely messages, just sending your best wishes, and and you've got your own challenges, but it was always deeply appreciated at the time of getting them.
Cheers. It's great to be on the sativa, yeah.
Well, if only it was so easy to get Russia and Ukraine together to talk, to shake hands. But it's lovely to have you. And Steve, just perhaps tell us why you're in London. Passing through, we, of course, heard and saw you in Alaska not so long ago.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I am, actually, or what time it is or what day it is, because we flew to Alaska for the summit, and then we flew back, and I'm here, but my luggage got lost on the way. Anyway, that was an amazing experience. I'm in Alaska. A very surprise summit, a surprise press conference that wasn't a press conference of the two presidents, Putin and Trump. And I'm not quite sure where we are after all of that. Are we any closer to peace? Doesn't look like it.
Well, that's what we're going to be discussing today. And James, of course, you were covering from Brussels, I think, the Washington meeting, the summit, call it what you will, with President Zelensky and, of course, all those other European leaders. So let's get straight to the first question this week. It's from Ian, and he says, what has changed after the recent Alaska and Washington meetings? Still no peace deal. Apparently, Vladimir Putin still believes he can win on the battlefield. What has changed, if anything, James?
I was reflecting on this, and I think the difficult answer is not very much. It is our job, isn't it, to try and glean some kind of insight. And, Donald Trump will give his view regularly, and that view will often change. Donald Trump perhaps changed his position on the question of security guarantees for Ukraine, that collective military assurance that the West, including America, would step in if the war was to start again, if Vladimir Putin had another go down the line. But we don't quite know what that means. He's ruled out boots on the ground. He has talked about air support. Is that the sharing of intelligence? Is that providing ammunition? We still don't yet know, and nothing yet has been promised. But that is something Europe and Ukraine have been desperate for, because it is still widely accepted that collectively as a continent, Europe isn't enough alongside the Ukrainian military to, for example, stop a concentration of Russian troops along an enormous, vast front line. At the moment, there are huge question marks and gaping gaps in detail as to how the West could act as a backstop so Ukraine could finally live as an independent country. So I do think there has broadly been a shift. But, I've been in Berlin, been in Brussels, watching Zelensky just try to rally support and insert Europe in the conversation. And actually, I think Europe has finally got itself in the conversation by getting to the White House.
Well, there's actually a second part to Ian's question. Maybe I'll put this one to you, Steve. The Russian media has been dismissive of Trump's peacemaking efforts. My question is, what do ordinary Russians make of the European and US peace brokering?
I think those Russians who watch state television and believe the narrative of state television that the obstacle to peace is NATO, America, Ukraine, people who believe that efforts are underway by the West to prevent peace in Ukraine. And that concerns people who actually believe that. However, when you speak to Russians on the street, and we do that all the time, most people we speak to just want this to be over. Right? They just want the war to be over because more and more people in Russia are being affected by it. More and more people that we talk to have got husbands or sons or brothers who are fighting in Ukraine. So it's affecting more and more people. And interestingly, the latest polling, and you have to be a bit cautious about opinion polls and surveys in Russia at the moment, but the latest polling suggests that more and more people want a negotiated settlement rather than a continuation of the war, which is quite interesting.
Just to pick up on what you're saying there about more and more people have relatives fighting and getting injured and dying, where do things stand at the moment? Because, there has been this, the narrative is that President Putin can carry on fighting pretty much as long as he wants. But, I mean, how difficult are the Russians finding it to get soldiers? Is there conscription? What's going on?
No, there isn't conscription. People, the Russian government is still throwing lots of money, big sums of money at this, and inviting volunteers to sign up and go and fight. And when you sort of drive around Moscow, you see the billboards, or drive around any Russian city, there are big billboards offering huge sums of money to people who are willing to, go to the military sign-up office and sign up for this war. So as long as there's money, I think there will be people who are willing to go and fight.
Can I ask about the motivation side? Because I see the Ukrainian side, where you've got a clear motivation to defend your country, against the oppressor. But when you talk to soldiers on the Ukrainian side, I'm so curious into what your average Russian soldier's motivation is, because there are guys that say they just keep coming. They are fighting hard for the territory we lose. And I just wonder, it's easier to defend, isn't it? What about the conqueror trying to kind of push forward in that sense?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, I'm sure there are some people amongst the Russian soldiers who believe they are doing the right thing, right? Because the Russian government is selling this as the defense of the motherland. Even though Russia has invaded Ukraine, Russians are being told they are fighting in the interests of Russia and in the interests of the Russian people. But the financial aspect is a key one here because, as I say, huge sums of money are being given to people who couldn't have dreamt about earning such money. So I think some people are driven maybe by ideology and the belief in the motherland. Other people, it's more financial.
Well, look, we've mentioned security guarantees already, and we've actually heard from someone called Ian already. But at the risk of sounding like a broken record, here's another question about security guarantees from another Ian, this time one who's in Scotland. And Ian says, Ukraine was given security guarantees in the 90s when it decommissioned Soviet nuclear weapons. What confidence can they have in guarantees given by today's Western politicians who may not last as long as Putin? James.
Ukraine has next to little confidence that there will be a Western-backed deal that will ensure their long-term security. And they point to, ever since it voted overwhelmingly to be an independent country after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there has been, as you say, the Budapest Memorandum. They had one of the world's biggest collection of nuclear missiles. They gave that up. The likes of the US, Russia, France, I think that they signed this deal saying, we'll recognise your borders in exchange for handing these over. We all know what's happened since. You've got the outbreak of the war in 2014, where the West decided to sanction Russia, the Obama administration, but not Putin himself or his inner circle. They tried to bring Ukraine and Russia to the table. There was appeasement. There were attempted ceasefires that failed time and time again. All the while, Russia held on to Crimea. Its proxies kept waging a war in the east of Ukraine, and little changed. And here we are again with all of this dialogue, but the bypassing of a ceasefire now, that's now not going to happen, that Ukraine desperately wants, where some kind of deal will be thrashed out, overseen by a president who is still clearly reluctant to bring out the American stick on the Russian president. He is still keen to cut a deal. He is still viewing this clearly as transactional. So there is very little belief at the moment that a lasting peace can be delivered.
Yeah, and I guess you brought up the history. In previous American presidents, Joe Biden, as you say, Barack Obama, he stayed away. He let the Europeans do the negotiation, the Minsk Accords. It wasn't the Americans involved in that. And Joe Biden, of course, was very keen to say, we can't push these too far. We don't want a nuclear war.
Yeah, and it's what the Biden administration signed off for Ukraine in a military sense. Huge amounts, but it's the way it was delivered which is a source of frustration. It was almost like this tiptoeing where it started, military hospitals, helmets, ammunition, missiles, tanks, F-16 fighter jets over the course of 2 years until he left office. And if you're Ukraine and you're weathering a full-scale invasion with against your much bigger neighbour, with more men, with an industry that is geared towards fighting this war, there's been a huge frustration. I remember when Trump retook office, there were some kind of voices of optimism in Kyiv saying, well, look, something had to change. The current trajectory for us was not good. Perhaps, Trump in his impatience for peace might actually step in and produce something meaningful. But, it's become so convoluted, and he's now seemingly accepting the complexities of this war. But how he compels Russia to put the brakes on. I remember you, Steve, right at the beginning of the invasion. You said Putin doesn't have a reverse gear.
Yeah.
And that has proved to be the case, hasn't it?
That's right. The Putin mobile doesn't have a reverse gear. It's going in one direction, and he isn't intending to stop.
Well, that brings us on to the person inside that mobile, because, as I'm sure you can imagine, lots of interest in the man who is very much back on the world stage, on the stage in America this week, Vladimir Putin. Let's hear our next question.
Hi, Ukrainecast. Rita from London here. I often hear that the one thing that might make Putin reconsider his actions in Ukraine is by imposing severe economic sanctions on Russia. But how are we so sure this would actually work? He's crushed all political opposition in Russia, so there probably wouldn't be any protests. He likely wouldn't suffer personally or financially because he's so wealthy, and he clearly doesn't seem to care about Russians' quality of life, considering how many he's sent to war and how many have died at war. At this point, it seems like invading Ukraine is an existential issue for him and almost bordering on being irrational. So why would economic sanctions, no matter how crippling they are, change any of this?
Sanctions. We've heard a lot about them. A lot of them have been imposed. I've lost count of the number of rounds of EU sanctions have been imposed. Gentlemen, what are your thoughts on sanctions?
I mean, it's a good question from Rita. I mean, existential. It is existential for Putin. And he never misses a moment, an opportunity to point out that Russia has survived thousands and thousands and thousands of international sanctions that have been imposed over the last 3 years. That does not mean, however, that the Russian economy is in a good state. It is creaking. There are major problems, right? The budget deficit is widening. Revenues from oil and gas are falling. Many branches of industry are approaching recession. So these are huge problems. And to wage a war, you need money, you need resources. And yes, this is a priority for the Russian government, and they will find money, but it's getting harder. So if, on paper, if, for example, India, China were not to buy Russian oil, in theory, that would be a major blow to the Russian economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think India's got another couple of weeks, hasn't it?
Yes.
The only concrete steps Donald Trump has taken is to give the green light for Europe and Ukraine to buy US weaponry, not to simply be given it in the name of what is right or wrong. They just have the permission to buy it now. But even then, we don't know what's coming through, air defence systems, but that is the only step taken in Ukraine's favour.
And on the subject of the secondary tariffs, the Russian press is full of articles pointing out that if Donald Trump went through with this threat of imposing secondary tariffs on China and India for buying Russian oil, that would damage America's economy. So I think there's a confidence in Moscow that this is an empty threat.
Well, can we move on to another question? Because it is about trade between Russia and the United States.
Hi, Ukrainecast. It's Andy McQuiston from Suffolk. After the summit, Putin addressed the press and said that there was a growth in trade between America and Russia of 20% since Trump's administration came into power. Is that correct? And that seems a long way away from increasing tariffs and reducing trade with Russia. Thank you.
Steve?
Well, I can't confirm the figures, but I mean, if it is 20%, it starts from a very low base because trade between Russia and America went right down, after the war.
Important context, yeah.
Absolutely. So even 20% on not very much isn't a great deal. But no, I mean, it is a fact that, America has been continuing to buy fertilizer from Russia, palladium, uranium. That hasn't stopped. And actually, India has pointed out that that's double standards, right? Because on the one hand, the Trump administration wants India to stop buying Russian oil, in theory, but India points out, well, you, America, are buying all these other things from Russia.
Yeah, I mean, interesting that it is something that Putin wants to talk up, though.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, Vladimir Putin knows that Donald Trump is a businessman. He loves talking about deals. So he may well have mentioned this 20%, thinking that it would make a good impression on President Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that brings us to the whole way that Vladimir Putin approached that summit and the way he's approached the relationship with Donald Trump.
Absolutely. If you look back over the last few months, there are many occasions when the Kremlin has pointed out that Russia and America can do great business together. There are lots of deals to be done. Cooperation in the Arctic, cooperation in Siberia. I remember when Vladimir Putin a few months ago went on TV late at night, gave a little interview, clearly designed to send a message to President Trump that, Moscow and Washington could really make a lot of money together,
And just on that point, again, I just want to ask Steve a question. But I've heard the argument in NATO military circles that for Putin to meet Zelensky, he clearly doesn't want to do that. He's improving relationships with Washington. But he would only do that, the argument was, if Russia's interests were furthered sufficiently from discussions in Alaska. If actually he was getting the assurances or concessions he wanted, then sure, I'd sit down with Zelensky. But no idea.
Absolutely. I mean, Vladimir Putin has said the conditions have to be right for him to meet President Zelensky. And I think what he means by conditions have to be right is, yes, that he gets everything he wants.
But would that meeting in itself be a concession from Putin if it happened?
Well, it depends what document was signed at the end of it, right? I think Vladimir Putin would be happy to sit down with President Zelensky if President Zelensky signed Ukraine's capitulation, for example.
Right, so a small concession from him would be the meeting if there was a big concession on the other side.
That's right. And at the moment, we've heard the Americans talking about talking up the idea of a Zelensky-Putin meeting. We haven't heard the Russians talking about that. All we've heard from Moscow is that some agreement was reached to raise the status of the delegates at the next direct talks between Ukraine and Russia. So perhaps at ministerial level, but no mention yet of...
It shouldn't be for the cameras, said Lavrov.
That's right. That's not for the cameras.
Not for the cameras.
That's right.
Well, I suppose there is a question about which leaders would be in place if this war were to drag on for much longer. And there is the possibility, of course, it could last much longer. And that is the subject of the next question.
Hi Ukrainecast, it's Kerry from the east of England. If Putin decided to drag on the war in Ukraine for another 5 years, surely by that time there would have to be free and independent elections in Ukraine. Or could Zelensky stay president indefinitely for the entirety of the war, no matter how long that is? And would he want to anyway?
Question from Kerry there. And there was a mention of elections, was there not, in the White House meeting between Zelensky and Putin and Trump?
Yeah, there were, and I mean, it was almost making light of the repeated Kremlin attempts to undermine Zelensky's legitimacy. Now, in Ukraine, elections are on hold because of martial law. That it would be illegal to hold them. So Parliament would have to approve the idea of relaxing martial law and allowing them to take place. Then you've got the practical difficulties. How on earth do you hold free and fair elections when a fifth of your country is occupied, where more of your country it comes under daily drone and missile attacks or artillery fire if you're close to the front line? How on earth do you wander to the ballot box and express your democratic wish? So there is that side of things. Technically, to answer the question, for 5 years, if the war went on, elections would not take place. I wonder, I mean, there is a growing view that Zelensky has the appetite to keep going. He's only been concentrating his power throughout this war. But, Valery Zelensky, General Zelensky, the former head of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, given an office job in London as the Ukrainian ambassador, there are reports that he's long been touted as a rival. But because of the existential nature of Russia's invasion, Zelensky's staunchest political foes have said, look, he's still our guy. He's still our leader legitimately. I wonder, you would imagine that might change over the next 5 years, but it's fraught with practical difficulties, even if the law changes.
Although we did have that sort of outpouring of public concern on the streets a few weeks ago, didn't we, about the attempt to bring through changes when it came to corruption.
Yes, but what we glean from that is the control Zelensky still has for reasons discussed on Parliament. So if the presidential office says we want to change, we bring in this new bit of legislation, or we want to kind of bring this more into our control, for now MPs of all parties and colours are playing ball. But that was a mistake on his part. But he still seems to have that power.
And Steve, if Zelensky was in power for another 5 years, clearly that would not be something that the Kremlin would like to see.
Well, no. I mean, the Kremlin, certainly for the last couple of years, there's been this concerted effort to delegitimise him. In all the comments from Russian officials, from the Kremlin down, they point out that President Zelensky's term in office expired, he's no longer legitimate, and this is rammed home from morning till night. The conclusion is, from that Vladimir Putin does not want to be seen sitting down at the negotiating table, negotiating with President Zelensky. As I say, he would probably sit down and sign something that he could present to the Russian people as victory for Russia, as the capitulation of Ukraine. But to be seen sitting as an equal negotiating with the Ukrainian president, I don't think that's anything that he wants to do.
Steve, thanks so much. Great to have you here with us. James, great to have you back as ever, and really happy to get you two guys together. Still trying to get my head around the fact that you hadn't actually met in person until now. But thanks for being here, and thank you for watching. We'll have another Q&A edition of Ukrainecast next week. But for now, from all of us here, thanks very much for watching.
Ukrainecast from BBC News.